If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, Seeds of Transformation. Part 1, The Empire Strikes Trade, Britain's Commercial Awakening. In the 1600s, England was about to change the world without even knowing it. While most European nations were still fighting over land and local trade, England decided to look far beyond its shores. The country was small and crowded, but its people had big dreams and bigger ships. The East India Company became England's secret weapon in this new kind of war. Founded in 1600, this wasn't just another trading group. It was a business with its own army, its own navy, and the power to make deals with foreign kings. The company received a royal charter that gave it exclusive rights to trade with Asia. This meant no other English company could compete with them in the most profitable markets of the world. English merchants quickly realized something important. The spices, silk, and tea from Asia weren't just luxury items. They were pure gold in European markets. A ship that left London with wool and iron could return with cargo worth 10 times more. But this trade required massive amounts of money up front. Ships took months to reach India or China, and many never returned due to storms, pirates, or disease. This risk created something completely new in England. Rich merchants and nobles began pooling their money together to fund these dangerous voyages. They created the world's first modern stock markets and insurance companies. If you had extra money, you could buy shares in a trading voyage. If the ship returned safely, everyone got rich. If it sank, you lost everything. The wealth flowing into England was staggering. Colonial territories provided not just exotic goods, but raw materials like cotton and sugar. English ships controlled trade routes across 3 continents. London became the financial center of Europe, with banks and investors managing money from around the globe. But perhaps most importantly, this global trade created a new type of English businessman. These men were used to taking huge risks and thinking on a massive scale. They had experience managing complex operations across thousands of miles. They understood how to organize workers, move materials, and solve technical problems. By the early 1700s, England had something no other country possessed. It had vast amounts of capital looking for new investments. It had a network of skilled managers and risk-takers. It had access to raw materials from every corner of the world. Most crucially, it had a culture that rewarded innovation and wasn't afraid of change. This commercial awakening set the stage perfectly for what would come next. When inventors began creating new machines and production methods, England already had the money, the business knowledge, and the global connections needed to turn these inventions into world-changing industries. Part 2. The Agricultural Revolution, Feeding the Future. In the 1700s, while English merchants counted their global profits, something equally important was happening in the countryside. Farmers were changing the way they grew food. These changes would prove just as revolutionary as any ship returning from distant lands. For centuries, English farmers had worked the same way their ancestors did. They planted the same crops in the same fields, year after year. They let their animals roam freely across common lands. They followed old traditions that barely fed the population. But now, landowners started asking a simple question. What if we could grow more food with less land? The answer came through 3 major changes. First, wealthy landowners began combining small, scattered plots into large, enclosed farms. This process pushed out many small farmers, but it allowed for better planning and more efficient farming methods. Second, farmers discovered crop rotation systems that restored soil fertility instead of exhausting it. Instead of leaving fields empty, they planted clover and turnips that actually made the soil richer. Third, they started breeding animals more carefully. selecting only the best cattle and sheep to produce offspring. These improvements worked like magic. Food production doubled in many areas. A single farm could now feed far more people than before. Wheat yields increased dramatically. Cattle grew bigger and produced more meat and milk. The English countryside was producing more food than ever before in history. But success created unexpected problems. The new farming methods required fewer workers. Thousands of rural laborers suddenly had no jobs. They could not afford to buy their own land, and the old common lands were now private property. These displaced workers faced a harsh choice: starve in the countryside or seek work elsewhere. At the same time, successful farmers were making huge profits. They had more money than they knew what to do with. Some invested in better farming equipment. Others looked for new business opportunities. This extra money would soon find its way into factories and new inventions. The displaced farm workers began walking toward England's growing towns and cities. They carried few possessions, but brought strong backs and desperate need for work. They crowded into urban areas, creating neighborhoods full of people willing to work long hours for low wages. Nobody planned this massive movement of people. It happened naturally as economic forces pushed workers out of agriculture and pulled them toward new opportunities. These former farm workers would become the first generation of factory employees, ready to operate the machines that inventors were just beginning to perfect. This agricultural transformation created the perfect conditions for what would come next. England now had surplus food to feed growing cities, extra money to invest in new technology, and thousands of workers ready for industrial jobs. The stage was set for machines to change everything. Part 3. Coal, Iron, and the First Sparks of Innovation. Britain's cities were growing fast, and they needed something new to keep them warm and running. Wood was becoming scarce and expensive. People began looking deeper into the ground for answers. What they found changed everything. Coal had been around for centuries, but most people avoided it. The black rock created thick smoke and left everything dirty. However, as forests disappeared and wood prices soared, coal became the only choice. Miners dug deeper shafts to reach the valuable fuel. Soon, coal carts rolled down muddy roads toward every major town. Abraham Darby faced a problem that many ironmakers shared. Traditional charcoal furnaces could not produce enough iron to meet growing demand. Charcoal required enormous amounts of wood, which was becoming impossible to find. In 1709, Darby tried something different at his furnace in Coalbrookdale. He heated coal in special ovens to remove impurities, creating a new fuel called coke. The results amazed everyone. Coke burned much hotter than charcoal and produced stronger iron. Darby's furnaces could now work continuously without stopping to gather more wood. Other ironmakers quickly copied his methods. Britain's iron production doubled, then doubled again. Deep in the coal mines, water created constant problems. As miners dug deeper shafts, underground springs flooded their tunnels. Workers spent more time pumping water than digging coal. Mine owners desperately needed a solution to this expensive problem. Thomas Newcomen, a blacksmith from Devon, studied the flooding issue for years. In 1712, he built a massive machine that used steam to pump water from mines. The atmospheric engine worked by heating water in a large boiler until it created steam. The steam pushed a piston up inside a cylinder. Then, cold water cooled the cylinder, creating a vacuum that pulled the piston back down. This motion powered pumps that lifted thousands of gallons of water from flooded mines. Newcomen's engines were loud, slow, and used enormous amounts of coal, but they worked. Mine owners installed these mechanical giants throughout Britain. For the first time, miners could reach coal seams hundreds of feet underground without drowning in water. These early innovations created a powerful cycle. Better iron made stronger engines and mining equipment. Deeper mines produced more coal to fuel more furnaces. Each improvement made the next breakthrough possible. Young inventors and craftsmen watched these developments closely. They began experimenting with steam pressure, gear systems, and metal casting techniques. Workshops buzzed with activity as men tried to make engines smaller, faster, and more efficient. The combination of abundant coal, quality iron, and steam power created opportunities that previous generations could never imagine. Britain now possessed the basic tools needed for much larger transformations. These early experiments would soon evolve into machines that could weave cloth, power factories, and move people across vast distances. The foundation was complete, ready to support the mechanical revolution that would reshape human civilization. Part 4. The Textile Pioneers. Machines begin to weave destiny. In a small workshop in 1733, John Kay watched his flying shuttle dart across a loom, faster than any weaver's hands could manage. This simple wooden device with metal tips would change everything. Before Kay's invention, making cloth required two people working together on wide fabric. One person threw the shuttle carrying thread from side to side, while another caught it. The process was slow and limited by how far a person could reach. Kay's flying shuttle moved along tracks with the pull of a cord. Now one person could weave cloth twice as wide and much faster. Weavers across England quickly adopted this tool. They could produce more fabric in less time, which meant more money for their families. But success created a new problem. Weavers could now work so fast that they ran out of thread. The spinning wheels that made yarn simply could not keep up with the hungry looms. For every piece of finished cloth, someone needed to spin 8 times as much thread. Women and children worked day and night at their spinning wheels, but it was never enough. This shortage pushed inventors to think harder. James Hargreaves created the spinning jenny in the 1760s, allowing one person to spin 8 threads at once instead of just one. Richard Arkwright went further with his water frame, which used water power to spin stronger thread continuously. These machines were too large and expensive for home use. Smart businessmen saw opportunity in this challenge. They built the first textile mills beside rivers where water could power the new machines. Thomas Lombay had already shown the way with his silk mill in Derby, where 300 workers operated Italian silk-making machines under one roof. Other entrepreneurs followed his example. Workers left their cottages and fields to tend these new machines in factories. Instead of working at their own pace at home, they now followed the rhythm of water wheels and mechanical gears. Families who had spun and woven together for generations found themselves separated. Men worked in one part of the mill, women in another, children helping where they could. The change was dramatic and sudden. Villages that had hummed with the sound of individual spinning wheels now fell quiet. Meanwhile, mill towns grew rapidly around these new factories. The focus shifted from scattered home production to concentrated industrial power. These textile innovations proved that machines could do what human hands had always done, but faster and more consistently. Factory owners made substantial profits, while traditional craftspeople struggled to compete with machine-made goods. The success of textile mechanization showed other industries what was possible. If cloth could be made by machines, what about metal goods, pottery, or paper? The textile mills became testing grounds for new ideas about organizing work, managing large groups of people, and using steam power when water was not available. Chapter 2. The Revolution Ignites. Part 1. The Spinning Revolution, Threading the Future. In the quiet English countryside of the 1760s, women sat in their homes, spinning thread by hand, just as their mothers and grandmothers had done for centuries. Each woman could produce only one thread at a time using a simple spinning wheel. This slow process created a serious problem as demand for cloth grew rapidly across Britain and its expanding empire. James Hargreaves, a weaver and carpenter from Lancashire, watched his wife work at her spinning wheel day after day. He knew that weavers like himself could work much faster than spinners could supply them with thread. This bottleneck frustrated everyone in the textile trade. In 1764, Hargreaves had a breakthrough. He invented the spinning jenny, a machine that could spin 8 threads at once instead of just one. The spinning jenny changed everything almost overnight. One person operating this wooden frame could now produce as much thread as 8 people working separately. The machine was simple enough that families could use it in their homes, yet powerful enough to dramatically increase production. Word spread quickly through the textile regions, and soon hundreds of these machines were humming in cottages across northern England. But inventors weren't finished. Richard Arkwright took the next crucial step in 1769 with his water frame. This machine produced stronger, finer thread than ever before, though it required water power to operate. Arkwright built the first factories around rivers, bringing workers together under one roof instead of letting them work at home. These early factories ran day and night, producing thread at speeds no one had imagined possible. The final breakthrough came when Samuel Crompton combined the best features of both earlier machines. His spinning mule, developed in 1779, could produce thread that was both strong and fine. A single spinning mule could do the work of hundreds of hand spinners. Factory owners quickly realized they could make enormous profits by installing dozens of these machines in large buildings. These mechanical advances solved the thread shortage that had limited textile production for generations. Suddenly, Britain could produce vast quantities of high-quality yarn at much lower costs. The price of cotton cloth dropped so dramatically that ordinary people could afford multiple sets of clothes for the first time in history. The effects rippled far beyond the textile industry. Factory owners needed workers, so people abandoned farming villages and flocked to rapidly growing industrial towns like Manchester and Birmingham. These urban centers became magnets for anyone seeking steady wages and opportunities. Britain's newfound ability to produce cheap, high-quality textiles gave the nation a massive advantage in global trade. British cloth flooded markets across Europe, America, and the colonies, often underselling local producers who still relied on hand methods. This manufacturing supremacy would fund Britain's rise as the world's dominant industrial and naval power. The simple act of spinning thread had been completely transformed, setting the stage for even more revolutionary changes in how things were made and where people lived. Part 2. Steam Power Unleashed, Watt's World-Changing Engine. Steam power unleashed Watt's world-changing engine. While spinning machines were making Britain rich from textiles, a Scottish instrument maker named James Watt was about to change everything again. In 1769, Watt took a look at the clunky steam engines that were already being used to pump water out of mines, and saw a big problem. These engines wasted enormous amounts of coal, because they had to reheat the cylinder every single time they worked. It was like heating up your entire oven just to warm a cup of coffee. Watt's brilliant fix was surprisingly simple. He added a separate chamber where the steam could cool down, while keeping the main cylinder hot all the time. This meant the engine used about 3 times less coal to do the same work. Suddenly, steam power became cheap enough for all kinds of businesses to use, not just wealthy mine owners who were desperate to keep water out of their shafts. The real magic happened when Watt teamed up with Matthew Boulton, a sharp businessman from Birmingham who had money and connections. Boulton saw immediately what this meant. He told Watt they weren't just selling steam engines, they were selling power itself. Together, they started the famous Boulton and Watt Company in 1775, and their improved steam engines began spreading across Britain like wildfire. Before Watt's engine, factories had to be built next to rivers or streams because flowing water was the only reliable way to power machines. This meant manufacturers were stuck in specific locations, often far from cities where workers and customers lived. Factory owners had to work around nature's schedule. When rivers froze in winter or ran low in summer, production stopped. Steam changed all of this overnight. Factory owners could now build wherever they wanted, as long as they could get coal delivered. This freedom transformed Britain's landscape. Manufacturing moved into cities where there were plenty of workers looking for jobs. Birmingham became the center for metal goods. Manchester exploded as the cotton capital. These cities grew incredibly fast as people poured in from the countryside seeking work. The steam engine also made factories much more productive. Machines could run faster and more consistently than ever before. A single steam engine could power dozens of spinning machines or looms at once. Factory owners could run their operations day and night, maximizing their profits. This reliability meant they could make firm promises to customers about delivery dates, something that had been impossible when they depended on unpredictable water power. Steam power created a snowball effect. As more factories used steam, coal mining expanded rapidly. Iron foundries grew to build more engines and factory equipment. Transportation improved as steam-powered machines moved goods more efficiently. What started as Watt's clever engineering solution had become the driving force behind a completely new way of organizing industry and society. Part 3. Arkwright's Factory System, the Birth of Industrial Capitalism. Richard Arkwright looked at his cotton mill and saw something no one had imagined before. Where other entrepreneurs ran small workshops with a handful of workers, Arkwright built something entirely different. He created the first true factory system, a massive operation that brought hundreds of workers under one roof to work together like parts in a giant machine. Steam power had given Arkwright the energy he needed, but his real genius lay in organizing people. He divided the work into simple, repetitive tasks. One person would feed cotton into a machine, another would watch the spinning, and someone else would collect the finished thread. Workers no longer needed years of training to make cloth. They could learn their single job in days. This system required strict rules that shocked people used to working at their own pace. Arkwright's workers had to arrive at exact times, marked by factory bells that rang across the growing industrial towns. They worked 12-hour shifts, with some factories running day and night. Anyone who showed up late faced fines. Workers who damaged equipment paid for repairs from their wages. The factory system created something entirely new: industrial discipline. Farmers had worked with the seasons and weather. Craftsmen had set their own schedules. But factory workers lived by the rhythm of machines. They ate when bells told them to eat, rested when managers allowed breaks, and worked at the speed the machines demanded. This transformation attracted thousands of people from the countryside. Young men and women left farming villages to work in Arkwright's mills and the factories that copied his methods. Towns like Manchester grew from small markets into sprawling industrial cities almost overnight. Entire families moved to be near the factories, creating dense neighborhoods of workers' housing. The factory system changed who got rich and how. Traditional craftsmen who had controlled their trades found themselves replaced by machines operated by cheaper workers. Meanwhile, factory owners like Arkwright accumulated wealth faster than anyone in history. They owned the buildings, the machines, and controlled the workers' labor. This created a new class of industrial capitalists who became incredibly powerful. The social effects spread far beyond the factory walls. Parents who had taught their children traditional crafts now sent them to work in mills instead. Communities that had existed for centuries around farming and handicrafts reorganized themselves around factory schedules. The old ways of making things, slowly, by hand, in small quantities, gave way to mass production. Arkwright's system proved so successful that entrepreneurs across Britain copied it. Textile factories spread throughout the north of England, each one drawing more workers from rural areas. The factory model then jumped to other industries. Soon, there were factories making everything from pottery to metal goods, all following Arkwright's basic pattern of organized labor, machine production, and strict management control. This industrial capitalism was creating a completely new kind of society, one where the relationship between workers and owners would define the next century of social and political conflict. Part 4. The Power Loom and Ironmaking, completing the industrial arsenal. While Arkwright's factories were producing yarn faster than ever before, they created a new problem. The machines could spin thread quickly, but someone still had to weave that thread into cloth by hand. Skilled weavers worked on traditional looms, but they could not keep up with the mountains of yarn pouring out of the spinning factories. This bottleneck meant that textile production still moved slowly at the final stage. Edmund Cartwright saw this problem and decided to solve it. In 1785, he invented the power loom, a machine that could weave cloth automatically. His loom used the same steam power that drove the spinning machines. One power loom could do the work of several hand weavers, and it worked continuously without getting tired. Factory owners quickly realized they could make cloth as fast as they could make yarn. The power loom changed everything for textile workers. Skilled weavers who had earned good money working from home suddenly found themselves replaced by machines operated by less skilled workers. Many weavers lost their jobs or had to work in factories for much lower wages. The machine had eliminated their craft and their independence. At the same time, ironmakers were solving their own production problems. For centuries, making iron required enormous amounts of wood for fuel, which made iron expensive and limited where it could be produced. But innovators began using coal instead of wood in blast furnaces. Coal burned hotter and was more plentiful than wood. Steam engines powered giant bellows that blasted air into the furnaces, making them even hotter and more efficient. These improvements made iron much cheaper and easier to produce. Suddenly, iron was available in quantities that previous generations could never have imagined. Factory owners could afford iron machines, iron tools, and iron building materials. The combination of cheap iron and efficient textile production created a powerful cycle of growth. With abundant iron and automated textile production, Britain's manufacturers could build bigger factories filled with more machines. Iron was used to make the machines that made textiles. Those machines produced cloth that could be sold to buy more iron for more machines. The profits funded even larger operations with more advanced equipment. This cycle accelerated when manufacturers realized they could use machines to build other machines. Iron foundries used steam-powered equipment to make parts for textile factories. Those textile factories generated profits that funded new ironworks. Each industry fed the growth of the other, creating an industrial system that seemed to expand by itself. The social impact was enormous. As machines replaced skilled craftsmen, traditional ways of working disappeared. People who had spent years learning trades found their knowledge worthless. Factory towns grew rapidly as displaced workers sought new jobs. The relationship between workers and owners became more distant and impersonal than it had ever been in small workshops. These changes set the stage for Britain to dominate world trade, as cheap iron and efficient textile production gave British manufacturers advantages that competitors in other countries could not match. Part 5. Cotton's Global Empire. Britain conquers world markets. Britain's new machines needed something to feed them, and that something was cotton. The factories could spin yarn and weave cloth faster than ever before, but they needed enormous amounts of raw cotton to keep running. This created a problem and an opportunity that would reshape the entire world. The solution came from across the Atlantic Ocean. British ships sailed to America's southern colonies, where enslaved people worked massive cotton plantations under brutal conditions. The cotton grown by enslaved hands was cheap and plentiful. Ship after ship carried bales of raw cotton from Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans to Liverpool and Manchester. This steady flow of cheap cotton gave British manufacturers a huge advantage over competitors in other countries. The system worked like a giant circle. Raw cotton traveled from American plantations to British factories. British machines turned this cotton into finished cloth that was better and cheaper than anything made by hand. Then British merchants sold this cloth all over the world, including back to the very colonies that had grown the cotton in the first place. British traders pushed into new markets across the globe. They sold cotton textiles in India, despite India having its own ancient textile traditions. They found customers in South America, Africa, and the Caribbean. British cloth was so cheap that it destroyed local textile industries in many countries. Indian weavers who had been famous for centuries found they could not compete with machine-made British cloth. The profits from this global cotton trade were enormous. Wealthy merchants in Liverpool and Glasgow built grand houses with money made from cotton trading. Factory owners in Manchester expanded their operations year after year. Banks grew rich by lending money to cotton traders and manufacturers. This wealth flowed back into more machines, bigger factories, and faster ships. The cotton trade created connections between distant parts of the world. A plantation owner in Georgia depended on British demand for his crop. A textile worker in Manchester depended on cotton ships arriving from America. A merchant in Calcutta saw his local cloth market destroyed by British imports. The world was becoming more connected, but this connection often benefited Britain at the expense of others. By the early 1800s, Britain controlled much of the world's cotton trade. British factories produced more cloth than any other country. British merchants had customers on every continent. The combination of cheap raw materials from colonies, efficient machines at home, and global markets for finished goods made Britain incredibly wealthy and powerful. This cotton empire was built on exploitation and suffering. Enslaved people in America provided the raw materials. Workers in British factories labored in dangerous conditions for low wages. Traditional craftsmen in other countries lost their livelihoods to British competition. But the profits kept flowing, and Britain's industrial lead kept growing. This dominance would soon spread to other industries, as British success in cotton showed the world what industrial power could achieve. Chapter 3: Revolution and Resistance. Part 1: The Luddite Uprising, when workers fought the machines. By 1811, the machines that factory owners praised as progress had become monsters in the eyes of skilled workers across England. In the textile mills of Nottingham, Yorkshire, and Lancashire, new knitting frames and power looms could do the work of dozens of craftsmen in half the time. But for the weavers, spinners, and knitters who had spent years learning their trades, these machines meant something terrible: the end of their way of life. The trouble started when mill owners began using the new machines to produce cheap, low-quality goods with unskilled workers who earned a fraction of what skilled artisans had commanded. A master weaver who once fed his family comfortably found himself competing with children operating power looms. Wages dropped so low that even working 16 hours a day barely bought bread for the table. The workers tried reasoning with their employers first. They petitioned Parliament and organized peaceful protests. But the mill owners saw only profits in the humming machines, and Parliament seemed deaf to their pleas. Desperation drove them to a different solution. If the machines were destroying their lives, then the machines had to go. Taking their name from a possibly mythical figure called Ned Ludd, groups of workers began gathering in the dead of night. They called themselves Luddites, and their mission was simple but dangerous. Armed with hammers, axes, and whatever tools they could find, they broke into factories and smashed the machines that threatened their survival. The attacks were not random acts of violence. The Luddites carefully chose which machines to destroy, often targeting only those used to produce inferior goods or operated by workers earning unfair wages. They sometimes left untouched the equipment of mill owners who treated their workers fairly. This showed they were not mindless destroyers, but desperate people making calculated strikes against what they saw as an unjust system. Entire communities supported the Luddites, even when they disagreed with the violence. Neighbors provided alibis, shopkeepers offered supplies. And local officials sometimes looked the other way. The machine breakers became folk heroes to people who watched their traditional way of life disappear under the steam and smoke of industrial progress. The government and factory owners responded with alarm and fury. They saw the Luddites not as desperate workers, but as dangerous rebels threatening the new economic order. Military troops marched into the textile regions, and spies infiltrated worker meetings. The authorities made machine breaking a crime punishable by death, showing how seriously they took this challenge to industrialization. These nighttime raids revealed the human cost of rapid industrial change. The Luddites forced society to confront an uncomfortable question: what happened to people when progress left them behind? Part 2. Bloody Repression. The government crushes dissent. The British government struck back with overwhelming force. Prime Minister Spencer Perceval declared the machine breakers enemies of progress and order. He sent thousands of soldiers into Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Nottinghamshire. More troops patrolled the textile regions than Wellington had taken to fight Napoleon in Spain. The message was clear. The government would crush any threat to the new industrial system. Parliament rushed through the Frame Breaking Act in 1812. This law made destroying textile machinery punishable by death. Before this, breaking a machine might cost a worker a few months in jail. Now it could cost his life. The law passed quickly, with little debate. Most politicians owned stock in textile companies or had friends who did. They saw their investments under attack. The military response was swift and brutal. General Thomas Maitland commanded the troops in Yorkshire. He treated the textile districts like occupied territory. Soldiers raided homes at night, searching for hammers and other tools used to break machines. They arrested anyone found with suspicious equipment. Spies infiltrated worker meetings, taking notes on who spoke against the machines. The trials began in 1813. At York Castle, 18 men faced the death penalty for machine breaking. The courtroom packed with their families and friends. Some defendants were barely 20 years old. They had grown up learning trades that machines now performed faster and cheaper. The judges showed no mercy. 13 men received death sentences. 3 were transported to Australia for life. Only 2 walked free. Factory owners cheered the harsh sentences. They had lost thousands of pounds worth of machinery to the Luddites. Some had hired private guards to protect their mills. Others had moved their families away from textile regions, fearing worker revenge. The death sentences, they believed, would end the violence and protect their property. The executions took place in January 1813. Huge crowds gathered to watch the hangings. Many wept openly as young men died for defending their way of life. The condemned men showed remarkable courage. George Mellor, a leader of the Yorkshire Luddites, walked to the gallows without trembling. His final words became legend among workers. He regretted only that he had not done more to help his fellow laborers. The government's victory came at a terrible cost. Families lost fathers and sons to the gallows or Australian prison ships. Children went hungry when breadwinners disappeared. Fear spread through working communities. People stopped meeting in groups. They whispered complaints instead of speaking openly. The harsh repression worked. Machine breaking nearly stopped by 1814. Workers learned that organized resistance could mean death. But the government's brutal response created deep resentment that would fuel future labor movements. The Industrial Revolution would continue, but the human cost of progress had become impossible to ignore. Part 3. The Humanitarian Awakening, Factory Acts and the Fight for Children. The harsh crackdown on the Luddites sent a clear message about government priorities. Workers learned they could not openly challenge the machines. But the brutal response also opened many eyes to the suffering caused by rapid industrial growth. people who had never set foot in a factory began asking uncomfortable questions about the price of progress. The most shocking discoveries came from the mills and factories where children worked. Boys and girls as young as 5 years old crawled under dangerous machines to collect cotton fibers. They worked 14 hours a day in hot, dusty rooms. Many developed curved spines from bending over machines. Others lost fingers or hands in the spinning wheels. Factory owners preferred children because their small hands could reach into tight spaces and they worked for much less money than adults. Stories of these working children reached the ears of wealthy reformers and religious leaders. They were horrified to learn that England's prosperity rested on the backs of suffering children. One of the most powerful voices belonged to Lord Ashley, later known as Lord Shaftesbury. This aristocrat made it his mission to expose the terrible conditions in Britain's factories. Ashley and other reformers pushed for official investigations. Government inspectors visited mills and interviewed child workers. What they found shocked even hardened politicians. Children testified about working from dawn to dusk without breaks. They described beatings when they fell asleep at their machines. Some had never seen daylight except on Sundays. These investigations created public outrage. Newspapers printed the children's stories. Middle-class families realized their cheap cotton clothes came from child suffering. Religious groups organized protests. Even some factory owners admitted the system had gone too far. The pressure led to the Factory Act of 1833. This law banned employment of children under 9 years old in textile mills. Children between 9 and 13 could work only 9 hours per day. The law also required 2 hours of education daily for child workers. Most importantly, it created the first factory inspectorate with real power to enforce these rules. The factory owners fought back hard. They claimed shorter hours would ruin British industry. They argued that poor families needed their children's wages to survive. Some tried to hide young children when inspectors visited. Others moved their worst practices to remote locations. But the inspectors proved determined. They arrived unannounced at factories. They interviewed children privately. They prosecuted owners who broke the law. Slowly, working conditions began to improve. Children gained a few precious hours of childhood. Some learned to read and write during their required education time. The Factory Act marked a turning point. For the first time, the government admitted it had a duty to protect workers from industrial exploitation. The law showed that public pressure could force change, even against powerful business interests. It proved that the human costs of progress could not be ignored forever. The fight for children's rights had begun, and it would inspire decades of labor reform that followed. Part 4. Railway Mania. The Iron Horse transforms Britain. The success of the Factory Acts created a wave of confidence across Britain. If the government could tame factory owners, perhaps progress itself could be controlled and directed. This optimism fueled the next great transformation that would sweep the nation. The Iron Horse was coming, and with it came dreams of unlimited wealth and endless possibility. The first passenger railway had opened between Liverpool and Manchester in 1830. People watched in amazement as the locomotive rocket thundered along iron tracks at 30 miles per hour. Horses could barely keep pace. Suddenly, a journey that once took days could be completed in hours. Word spread quickly about this mechanical marvel that could carry hundreds of passengers and tons of cargo, faster than anything humanity had ever known. By the 1840s, railway fever gripped Britain like an epidemic. Newspapers filled with advertisements for new railway companies seeking investors. Clerks, farmers, widows, and merchants all rushed to buy railway shares. They believed every new line would bring enormous profits. Maps appeared showing proposed railways connecting every village and town across the country. Speculators promised that railways would transform sleepy market towns into bustling commercial centers. The construction boom began almost immediately. Thousands of workers called navvies descended upon the countryside with shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. They carved through hills, built bridges over rivers, and laid mile after mile of iron track. The work was brutal and dangerous. Men died in explosions, cave-ins, and accidents. Yet, the wages were good, and the work continued at a frantic pace. Towns that gained railway connections flourished overnight. Farmers could ship fresh milk to London markets before it spoiled. Factory owners could transport raw materials and finished goods faster and cheaper than ever before. Mail that once took weeks to deliver now arrived in days. The entire rhythm of British life began to accelerate. But the railway boom also brought chaos and disappointment. Many investors lost their life savings when poorly planned railway companies collapsed. Some lines were built to nowhere, connecting towns that generated little traffic. The competition between railway companies became fierce and often wasteful, with multiple lines serving the same routes while other areas remained isolated. The physical transformation of Britain was stunning. Railway embankments scarred ancient landscapes. Steam engines belched smoke across previously quiet valleys. Traditional coaching inns closed as stagecoaches became obsolete almost overnight. Rural communities found themselves either connected to the wider world or left behind entirely. By 1850, Britain possessed over 6,000 miles of railway track. The iron network had fundamentally altered how people thought about distance, time, and possibility. A farmer's son could now travel from Yorkshire to London in a single day to seek his fortune. This mobility would soon create new social movements as workers discovered they could organize and communicate across vast distances with unprecedented speed. Part 5. The Communist Manifesto and the Birth of Worker Movements. The year 1848 burst across Europe like a wildfire. Revolutions erupted in France, Germany, Austria, and beyond. Workers and citizens took to the streets demanding change. Kings trembled on their thrones. In the midst of this chaos, two German thinkers named Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published a small booklet that would shake the world more than any cannon. The Communist Manifesto arrived at exactly the right moment. Factory workers across Europe had grown tired of their miserable lives. They worked 16 hours a day for barely enough money to buy bread. Their children labored alongside them in dangerous conditions. Meanwhile, factory owners grew rich beyond imagination. The contrast was stark and painful. Marx and Engels had watched this unfold with growing anger. They saw how the new industrial system created two distinct groups. On one side stood the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, bankers, and business leaders who owned everything. On the other side were the proletariat, the workers who owned nothing but their ability to work. These two groups, Marx argued, were locked in an eternal struggle. The manifesto spoke directly to workers in language they could understand. It declared that all of history was a story of class struggle. It proclaimed that workers had nothing to lose but their chains. Most importantly, it called for workers of all countries to unite against their oppressors. The booklet spread quickly through underground networks, passed from hand to hand in factory towns. Workers began to organize like never before. They formed trade unions, despite laws that made such organizations illegal. These early unions faced brutal opposition. Employers fired anyone suspected of organizing. Police arrested union leaders. Yet the movement continued to grow. Workers discovered they had power when they stood together. The railway networks that now connected cities made organization easier. A strike in Manchester could inspire workers in Birmingham within days. Ideas traveled as fast as the steam trains that carried them. Workers began to see themselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a vast, exploited class. Factory owners and governments responded with fear and violence. They banned union meetings. They imprisoned organizers. They hired private armies to break up strikes. But each act of repression only strengthened worker resolve. The harsh response proved that Marx was right. The owners and workers were indeed enemies locked in struggle. The immediate impact of 1848 varied across Europe. Most of the political revolutions failed. Kings remained on their thrones, but something deeper had changed forever. Workers had tasted their own power. They had seen what organization could achieve. Trade unions began demanding shorter working days, better wages, and safer conditions. They organized strikes and boycotts. They created mutual aid societies to help members in times of trouble. Most importantly, they began to think politically. Workers started demanding the right to vote and representation in government. The ideas Marx and Engels planted in 1848 would grow into movements that would reshape the entire world. The age of organized labor had begun, and with it came the promise that workers would never again face the industrial machine alone and defenseless. Chapter 4. The Second Wave, Part 1. The Crystal Palace Moment. Britain displays its industrial supremacy. In May 1851, something extraordinary happened in London that would change how the world thought about progress and power. A massive building made entirely of glass and iron rose from the ground in Hyde Park. People called it the Crystal Palace, and inside this gleaming structure, Britain was about to show the world exactly what industrial might looked like. The building itself was a marvel. Stretching over 1,800 feet long and 400 feet wide, it enclosed mature elm trees within its glass walls. Joseph Paxton, a gardener turned architect, designed this iron and glass cathedral in just 9 days. The structure required over 293,000 panes of glass and 5,000 tons of iron. Workers assembled the entire building like a giant puzzle, using mass-produced parts that fit together perfectly. This construction method was itself a demonstration of industrial precision. Queen Victoria opened the Great Exhibition on May 1st, with Prince Albert by her side. Over 6 million visitors would pass through those glass doors during the next 6 months. They came from across Britain and around the world, many taking the new railways for their first long journey. Working families saved their pennies for months just to see what their nation had accomplished. Inside the Crystal Palace, Britain displayed over 100,000 objects that told the story of industrial transformation. Visitors gasped at massive steam engines, their pistons moving with mechanical precision. They marveled at textile machines that could weave patterns more complex than any human hand. There were locomotives, telegraphs, and photographs. Raw materials from the colonies filled entire sections, while finished British goods showed what industrial processing could create. The exhibition was not just about machines. It was Britain's way of saying, "Look what we have built," to the rest of the world. German visitors studied British manufacturing techniques. American inventors examined new processes they could adapt back home. The French government sent official delegations to understand British industrial methods. Knowledge flowed freely, as Britain felt confident that their head start was so significant that sharing information would not threaten their dominance. Common people experienced something entirely new. Families who had never seen anything beyond their village suddenly encountered goods from India, machinery from Manchester, and crafts from dozens of nations. They witnessed firsthand the power of industrial production. A single machine could make more cloth in a day than their grandmother could weave in months. The Crystal Palace moment marked a turning point. Other nations realized they needed to industrialize rapidly or risk being left behind. The exhibition inspired similar events worldwide and accelerated technology transfer between countries. Britain had demonstrated industrial leadership, but in doing so, it had also lit a fire under its future competitors. The very success of the Great Exhibition would eventually challenge British supremacy as other nations learned to build their own industrial foundations. Part 2. The Bessemer Revolution. The Age of Steel begins. In 1856, a British inventor named Henry Bessemer faced a problem that had frustrated metalworkers for centuries. Making good steel was slow, expensive, and unpredictable. The old methods required skilled craftsmen to heat iron in small batches, carefully controlling the temperature and timing. This process could take days and cost a fortune. Most construction still relied on iron, which bent and broke under heavy loads, or expensive steel that only the wealthy could afford. Bessemer had been working on military contracts when he realized something revolutionary. Instead of slowly heating iron in furnaces, what if he blasted air directly through molten iron? The idea seemed crazy to traditional metalworkers. They believed air would ruin the metal. But Bessemer built a large egg-shaped container called a converter and tried his experiment anyway. The results shocked everyone. When pressurized air shot through the molten iron, it created spectacular fireworks inside the converter. The air burned away impurities in minutes instead of hours. What emerged was high-quality steel, produced faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. A process that once took a full day now finished in 20 minutes. The cost dropped from expensive luxury to affordable material. Word of Bessemer's method spread quickly through industrial Britain. Factory owners rushed to license his process. Steel production exploded across the country. What had been a rare, costly material became common and cheap. This transformation changed everything that followed. Shipbuilders immediately saw the possibilities. Steel ships could be larger, stronger, and lighter than iron vessels. They could carry more cargo across longer distances. Naval engineers designed warships with steel armor that could withstand powerful new cannons. Merchant ships became floating warehouses, revolutionizing global trade. Bridge builders abandoned their conservative designs. The old iron bridges had limited spans and constant maintenance problems. Steel bridges could stretch farther and carry heavier loads. Engineers designed railway bridges that spanned wide rivers and deep valleys. Cities began connecting previously isolated regions with steel spans that seemed impossible just years before. Architects started dreaming bigger. Steel frames could support taller buildings than ever before. The material's strength meant thinner walls and larger windows. Cities began reaching skyward as steel skeletons supported structures that would have collapsed under their own weight if built with traditional materials. Machine builders found steel perfect for their needs. Factory equipment became more precise and durable. Railway companies ordered steel rails that lasted longer and supported heavier trains. The improved infrastructure allowed even faster transportation of goods and people. The Bessemer process created a cycle of growth. Cheap steel made better machines. Better machines produced more goods more efficiently. More efficient production created wealth that funded even more industrial expansion. Britain's industrial lead, already demonstrated at the Crystal Palace, now had the material foundation to support the next wave of growth. The age of steel had begun, and with it came the tools to build an industrial world that would stretch across continents. Part 3. Railways span continents. Iron roads connect the world. With cheap steel now flowing from Bessemer's furnaces, engineers could finally build the iron roads they had dreamed of for decades. The first railways in Britain had used brittle iron rails that cracked under heavy loads and constant use. Steel changed everything. These new rails could carry massive locomotives pulling dozens of cars loaded with coal, grain, and passengers. The railway boom started in Britain but quickly spread across the world. By the 1850s, steel tracks stretched across the English countryside, connecting every major city and industrial town. Farmers could ship fresh milk to London before it spoiled. Factory owners could move raw materials from distant mines to their workshops in days instead of weeks. What once took a horse-drawn cart a full day to travel now took a steam train just an hour. In America, The scale became truly breathtaking. Railroad companies pushed steel tracks across vast prairies, through mountain passes, and over mighty rivers. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts for the first time. A journey that once took months of dangerous travel by wagon now took just 1 week by train. Chinese immigrants working from the west and Irish workers building from the east met at Promontory Point, Utah, driving a golden spike to mark this achievement. These iron roads created something entirely new: national markets. A wheat farmer in Kansas could sell his grain to buyers in New York. A textile mill in Massachusetts could ship finished cloth to customers in California. For the first time in history, distance mattered less than efficiency and price. The railways forced another change that touches every life today. Before trains, each town kept its own time based on the sun's position. When it was noon in Boston, it might be 11:58 in Providence and 12:07 in Hartford. This chaos made train schedules impossible. Railway companies solved this by creating standard time zones. Suddenly, everyone in the Eastern time zone shared the same clock, regardless of where the sun actually stood in their local sky. Cities exploded in size around railway stations. Chicago grew from a small trading post to America's second-largest city simply because it sat at the center of the nation's rail network. Goods flowed in from farms and flowed out to markets. People arrived daily, seeking work in the new industries that railways made possible. The speed of change accelerated beyond anything previous generations had experienced. News that once took weeks to travel now moved in days. People could relocate hundreds of miles for better opportunities. Ideas spread faster as newspapers reached distant towns quickly. The world was shrinking, connected by ribbons of steel that carried more than just freight and passengers. They carried the future itself, setting the stage for the massive urban centers that would soon reshape human civilization. Part 4. Urbanization's Dark Side, Cities of Smoke and Desperation. As the railways brought thousands of people streaming into industrial cities, these places transformed into something the world had never seen before. Manchester grew from a small market town to over 300,000 people in just 50 years. Birmingham doubled its size every few decades. People came seeking jobs in the new factories, but they found conditions that shocked even those who had lived through rural poverty. The factories needed workers close by, so entire neighborhoods sprouted up almost overnight around the mills and foundries. Builders threw up cheap housing as fast as possible to house the flood of newcomers. These weren't comfortable homes, but cramped, dark rooms where entire families squeezed into spaces barely big enough for one person. 10 people might share a single room, sleeping in shifts because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down at once. The air itself became dangerous to breathe. Factory smokestacks belched black clouds that mixed with coal smoke from thousands of heating fires. The sun often disappeared behind a thick blanket of soot that settled on everything and everyone. People's clothes, food, and skin turned gray with grime. Children who had never seen clean air developed terrible coughs that never went away. Water became poison in these growing cities. With so many people packed together and no proper sewage systems, human waste flowed directly into the same rivers where people drew their drinking water. Cholera and typhoid swept through neighborhoods like wildfire. In some districts, half the children died before their 5th birthday. The smell alone could knock a person over. Factory owners grew wealthy while their workers lived in misery. A mill owner might build a mansion on a hill outside the city, while his employees shared cellars that flooded with sewage when it rained. The contrast was stark and bitter. Those with money could escape to cleaner areas, while the poor had nowhere to go. Workers began to organize and push back against these conditions. They formed unions despite laws that made such gatherings illegal. They went on strike, even though it meant their families would go hungry. Some demanded better wages, while others simply wanted windows in their workplaces or clean water for their children. The wealthy and powerful started to worry. Disease didn't respect class boundaries, and epidemics that began in poor neighborhoods quickly spread to affect everyone. Some factory owners realized that sick, desperate workers weren't as productive as healthy ones. A few politicians began to see that something had to change before the cities exploded in violence. This growing awareness that industrial cities were becoming uninhabitable would soon force a reckoning with the true cost of rapid progress. Chapter 5: The Global Transformation. Part 1. Electricity illuminates the future. Edison, Tesla, and the power grid. In the 1870s, most factories still relied on steam engines and gas lamps. Workers went home when darkness fell because artificial light was expensive and dangerous. But two brilliant inventors were about to change everything. Thomas Edison in America and Nikola Tesla, a Serbian immigrant, would battle over how to bring electricity to the world. Edison opened the first practical electric power station in New York City in 1882. His direct current system lit up Pearl Street and nearby buildings with bright, safe electric bulbs. For the first time, people could flip a switch and light appeared instantly. No matches, no oil, no gas fumes. Business owners quickly saw the possibilities. Factories could now run night shifts safely. Workers no longer squinted in dim light or worried about gas explosions. Tesla had a different vision. He believed alternating current could carry electricity much farther than Edison's direct current. George Westinghouse, a businessman, bought Tesla's patents and started the famous War of Currents. Edison fought back hard, even staging public demonstrations where he electrocuted animals to show how dangerous alternating current could be. But Tesla's system won. Alternating current could travel hundreds of miles from power plants to cities. This meant electricity could reach small towns and rural areas, not just big cities. By 1893, Tesla's generators lit up the Chicago World's Fair, amazing millions of visitors with this new electric wonder. The changes came fast. Electric motors replaced steam engines in factories. These motors were cleaner, quieter, and easier to control. Factory owners could design buildings differently because they no longer needed huge steam boilers and coal storage areas. Assembly lines became possible because electric power could run many small machines precisely. Cities transformed completely. Electric streetlights made streets safer at night. Electric trolleys replaced horse-drawn carriages. The first electric elevators allowed buildings to grow taller. Department stores stayed open after dark, creating new shopping habits. People's daily routines changed as artificial light extended their productive hours. Communication leaped forward too. Electric telegraph systems already connected distant cities, but now electric power made telephone networks possible. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, powered by electricity, let people talk across vast distances instantly. Business deals that once took weeks of letter writing could happen in minutes. The electric revolution spread globally. European cities raced to install power grids. Electric power transformed mining, allowing deeper excavations with better lighting and ventilation. Steel mills used electric furnaces to create stronger alloys. Even farming changed as electric pumps brought water to dry lands. By 1900, electricity was reshaping how people lived and worked everywhere. The power grid became the nervous system of modern civilization, connecting homes, factories, and cities in an electric web that would soon span continents. Part 2. The Chemical Revolution. Synthetic materials transform industry. While electricity powered the new industrial world, scientists were making discoveries in their laboratories that would change everything people touched, ate, and wore. The late 1800s brought a chemical revolution that transformed raw materials into products nobody had ever seen before. This wasn't just about mixing ingredients in test tubes. It was about creating entirely new substances that nature had never made. The story began with colors. For thousands of years, People had used natural dyes from plants, insects, and minerals to color their clothes. Purple came from sea snails and cost more than gold. Blue came from a plant called indigo. Then in 1856, an 18-year-old English student named William Perkin was trying to make artificial quinine in his home laboratory. Instead, he created a brilliant purple dye by accident. He called it movine, and it changed everything. This synthetic purple could be made cheaply in factories. Within months, wealthy women across Europe were wearing purple dresses that once only royalty could afford. Other chemists rushed to create more artificial colors. Soon, factories were producing bright reds, deep blues, and vivid greens that were more brilliant than anything found in nature. The German chemical industry became dominant, turning coal tar waste into rainbow-colored profits. But the real breakthrough came when chemists learned to make artificial fertilizer. Farmers had always depended on animal manure and natural deposits to feed their crops. As cities grew larger, they needed more food than traditional farming could provide. Two German scientists, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, solved this problem by figuring out how to pull nitrogen from the air and turn it into fertilizer. Their process required enormous amounts of electricity and extreme pressure, but it worked. The Haber-Bosch process became the foundation of modern agriculture. Farmers could now grow much more food on the same amount of land. Populations that might have starved could now be fed. This artificial fertilizer helped feed the growing industrial cities. But it also had a dark side. The same chemicals that helped crops grow could be turned into explosives for warfare. Chemical companies expanded rapidly, creating synthetic materials for every part of life. They made artificial medicines that could fight diseases more effectively than traditional remedies. Aspirin, developed in German laboratories, could reduce pain and fever better than willow bark tea. Companies created new plastics, synthetic rubber, and artificial fabrics that were cheaper and sometimes better than natural materials. By 1900, chemistry had become as important to industrial power as steam engines and electricity. Countries with advanced chemical industries could feed larger populations, equip stronger armies, and produce goods that amazed the world. The ability to transform simple molecules into complex materials gave industrial nations enormous advantages. As America watched Europe's chemical revolution create wealth and power, it prepared to build its own industrial empire that would soon surpass them all. Part 3. America Rises. The Second Industrial Revolution crosses the Atlantic. The American Civil War ended in 1865, leaving behind a broken nation with destroyed cities and ruined farmland. But something remarkable happened in the decades that followed. America took the industrial ideas that had made Britain wealthy and made them bigger, faster, and more powerful than anyone thought possible. The secret weapon was steel. While Europe still relied heavily on iron, American inventors like Andrew Carnegie figured out how to make steel cheaply and in huge amounts. Steel was stronger than iron and could be shaped into massive beams for buildings and rails for trains. Carnegie's steel mills in Pittsburgh worked day and night, filling the air with smoke and the ground with profit. By 1900, America made more steel than Britain and Germany combined. This steel fed America's greatest project, the Transcontinental Railroad. Before the Civil War, traveling from New York to California meant a dangerous journey that took months. The railroad changed everything. Workers laid thousands of miles of steel track across mountains, deserts, and plains. When they finished in 1869, a person could travel coast to coast in just 1 week. Suddenly, wheat from Kansas could feed people in Boston. Cattle from Texas could be shipped to Chicago's massive slaughterhouses. The railroads created an explosion of city growth. Chicago grew from a small trading post to a giant metropolis in just 30 years. People poured in from farms and foreign countries, all looking for factory jobs. These new Americans worked in steel mills, meatpacking plants, and textile factories that ran on the latest machines Europe had invented. But America didn't just copy European ideas. American inventors improved them. Thomas Edison's electric light bulbs made it possible for factories to run at night. His power stations brought electricity to city streets, making them safer and brighter than ever before. George Westinghouse's electrical system could send power across long distances, lighting up entire neighborhoods. American factories became marvels of efficiency. Henry Ford would soon perfect the assembly line, where workers stood in one spot while products moved past them. This made cars, tools, and household goods faster and cheaper than traditional methods. What once took skilled craftsmen hours to make could now be produced in minutes. The numbers tell the story of America's rise. In 1860, Britain was the world's industrial leader. By 1900, America had taken that crown. American factories produced more goods, American railroads carried more cargo, and American cities housed more people than anywhere else on Earth. This transformation amazed European observers, who had once looked down on America as a backwards farming country. Now European companies struggled to compete with American steel, American machines, and American methods. The student had become the teacher, and the world would never be the same. America's industrial success would soon drive it to look beyond its own borders for new markets and resources. Part 4. Industrial Imperialism, the Scramble for Resources. As America flexed its new industrial muscles, European powers watched with growing alarm. They realized that controlling raw materials and markets had become a matter of national survival. If you owned the sources of cotton, rubber, metals, and oil, you could feed your factories and keep them running. If you controlled where those finished goods were sold, you guaranteed profits. This simple logic would reshape the entire world map. Britain had already learned this lesson well. British factories needed cotton from India and Egypt. British ships needed coal stations across the globe. British merchants needed customers who had no choice but to buy British goods. The solution was empire. By the 1880s, Britain controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, and beyond. Other industrial nations watched Britain's success with envy and fear. Germany, newly united and rapidly industrializing, desperately needed its own empire. German steel mills required iron ore. German chemical companies needed rubber. German manufacturers needed markets that weren't already sewn up by British competitors. But when German leaders looked at the world map, they saw a problem. Britain and France had already claimed the best territories. This sparked what historians call the Scramble for Africa. In just 20 years, European powers carved up an entire continent like pieces of a pie. They drew borders with rulers on maps in European conference rooms. Local African leaders found their kingdoms suddenly split apart or merged with traditional enemies. The Berlin Conference of 1884 set the rules for this division, but no African representatives were invited to attend. The human cost was staggering. In the Belgian Congo, King Leopold's agents forced local people to collect rubber under brutal conditions. Millions died from violence, disease, and exhaustion. British forces crushed resistance movements across Africa with modern weapons. French colonial officials imposed harsh taxes that forced Africans to work in European-owned mines and plantations. Meanwhile, European powers targeted Asia with equal determination. The British tightened their grip on India, turning it into a captive market for British textiles while destroying local industries. European gunboats forced China to open its ports to foreign trade through a series of humiliating wars. Japan watched these events closely and decided to modernize rapidly rather than become another victim. Colonial territories provided exactly what industrial nations needed. African mines supplied gold, diamonds, and copper. Asian plantations grew tea, coffee, and spices. These raw materials flowed to European factories at cheap prices. The finished products then flowed back to colonial markets at high prices, creating a cycle of wealth extraction that enriched industrial centers while impoverishing their colonies. This global system of industrial imperialism created the first truly interconnected world economy. But it also planted seeds of future conflict. Industrial nations now competed not just in factories, but for control of entire continents. This competition would soon escalate beyond economic rivalry into military confrontation, setting the stage for unprecedented global warfare. Part 5. The New Industrial Order: Labor, Reform, and Social Transformation. The endless stream of raw materials from colonies fed the growing industrial machine. But back home in Europe and America, a different kind of revolution was brewing. Workers who had endured decades of dangerous conditions and crushing poverty began to organize like never before. They had seen enough broken bodies, heard enough widows weep, and watched enough children work themselves to death in the mills. The first major victory came in Britain around 1900. Faced with mounting strikes and growing political pressure, Parliament passed laws limiting working hours and requiring safety measures in factories. Other industrial nations watched nervously as British workers gained new rights. Soon, similar laws appeared across Europe and North America. Factory owners who had ruled like kings found themselves answering to government inspectors. These changes didn't happen by accident. Workers had learned to join together in unions that could shut down entire industries. When coal miners in Wales went on strike, trains stopped running across Britain. When steelworkers in Pittsburgh walked out, American factories ground to a halt. Governments could no longer ignore the power of organized labor. Smart politicians realized they needed to act before revolution replaced reform. Germany led the way under Otto von Bismarck, who created the world's first national insurance system for workers. If a man got hurt in a factory, the government would help pay his bills. If he grew old and couldn't work, he would receive a pension. Other countries scrambled to copy these ideas. The old system where governments stayed out of business affairs was crumbling. New laws required safer working conditions, limited child labor, and guaranteed minimum wages. Government inspectors walked through factories checking for dangers. Courts began ruling in favor of injured workers instead of always protecting business owners. Women workers, who had been doubly oppressed, found their voices too. The tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York killed 146 workers, mostly young women, because the owners had locked the exit doors. Public outrage forced politicians to pass stronger safety laws. Women's suffrage movements gained strength as working women demanded not just better jobs, but the right to vote for leaders who would protect them. By 1914, the industrial world looked completely different from the brutal early days of steam-powered mills. Workers had weekends off, children attended school instead of working in mines, and governments provided safety nets for the poor and elderly. The idea that society should protect its weakest members had taken root in the industrial soil. This transformation created a new kind of society where governments balanced the needs of business with the rights of workers. But these hard-won reforms would soon face their greatest test. As industrial nations prepared for a massive war that would consume everything they had built, the question remained whether these social advances could survive the coming storm.